Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Very warm welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning. I hope you can all hear me well enough. I'm sure you can. I've been asked to do a session on fire prevention on construction sites, and I'll be focusing, I suppose, on the Joint Code of Practice and the requirements that exist therein. Sadly, with the time allowed, I'm not going to be able to do the Joint Code real justice, so I'm going to focus, I think, on certain particular elements. The presentation's got lots of slides in it, which I thought might be useful for future reference, but as I said, I won't be discussing them all in detail today. What I'd like to do is look very quickly at the purpose of the code and its origin, its status and its purpose, and to a certain extent its scope. Look at some of the key specific requirements that exist, and then maybe address some continuing concerns that, with regard to fire safety on construction sites. I've been told to tell you there's a quiz at the end, just to make sure you all pay attention, but I think that might not quite be the truth. So, moving on. If I can work the IT. There we go. So what are we really talking about when it comes to construction? I think that it's quite easy for us to consider construction as being starting with a big hole in the ground and building something out of it. But as far as the wider definition of construction, and certainly the one that's used within the Joint Code by way of defining what it covers, it's far broader than that. It covers not just new build, but also renovation, repair and upkeep, any form of redecoration and forms of maintenance work, if there's any form of installation or modifications to plant and other fixed equipment, and certainly where you may be installing new services or removing existing services. And it will also consider and also covers dismantling of existing buildings and final demolition. To a certain extent, despite the fact that the environments will all be different and the processes will all be different, the principles with regard to effective fire safety management during that construction phase are all going to be relatively similar. So what was the problem? We've got some fairly aged statistics here which describe where the Joint Code of Practice came out of. And as you can see there, if we look back to the late 1980s, the early 1990s, construction industry premiums were in the region of 80 to 90 million pounds. Those figures are representative of around 85% of the active UK construction market at the time. So if we were to scale it up, we'd probably be looking at nearer 95 million. But there's just beneath that a couple of examples of some direct losses which resulted from fire during the construction of buildings. The most significant of that, I suppose, being the fire that happened at Minster Court. Some of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with the building in its current guise. However, at the time, it was a large construction, very much nearing completion. A fire was started. It is thought through a discarded match into some dry waste and rubbish on one of the lower floors, which spread very quickly into the atrium. The atrium was lined with scaffolding. For some strange reason, they'd be using polystyrene blocks cased in cardboard to support the scaffolding. I'm not quite sure how that arrangement functions, but it was these sorts of materials that were ignited, and the fire spread up through the atrium and did a huge amount of damage. It blew the top off the atrium eventually. And the figures you see banded about for the losses as a result of the fire are in the region of 120 million. I've seen figures which suggest it was about 105, with consequential losses beyond that of an additional 60 million pounds, so quite significant. And as that little note at the bottom of the slide says, to sustain these kinds of losses, I'll put my teeth in, premiums would need to have increased by around 400 to 500% simply to cover the extent of those losses. So at that point, it was decided that something needed to be done to ensure that these sorts of problems could be mitigated and avoided wherever possible, and that was where the Joint Code of Practice was born out of. Eventually, the first edition was published in 1992. There's a graph there just showing you causes of serious fires, those costing in excess of £100,000. The statistics are somewhat dated. As you'll see, there's a category in there for smoking materials at 7% and rubbish burning at 3%. Now, rubbish burning does still does still occur on some sites, albeit it's probably not permitted. And similarly, smoking materials do continue to cause fire on building sites. However, I expect that those figures are slightly higher than they should be. But this information is based on older statistics. You can, however, see that deliberate ignition, arson, continues to cause a huge number of problems or a huge number of fires, as do the use of any form of, or undertaking any form of hot work. So that's the current edition of the Joint Code. It's a very pleasant brown colour this time round. It's in its 9th edition and is 14 years old. And as it says at the top there, it's somewhat of a Bible really for insurance surveyors. However, it's also widely used within the construction industry. I'm not sure it's as widely used as we would like it to be, particularly during the design phases of the project. But certainly, it's very widely used during the construction phases. And there's just a list there of the sorts of things it considers: protection from causes of fire and explosion through deliberate or accidental means, preventing fire spread through the use of materials, and how this might be managed successfully to ensure the project completes on time, and there are no significant problems during that process. And it does this in a number of ways, which we'll come on to shortly. Other guidance does exist. The Health and Safety Executive are the enforcing authority for construction works. Doesn't mean you don't have to do a fire risk assessment under the life safety legislation, as it were, the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, which just covers general fire precautions. But the Health and Safety Executive are the enforcing authority, and they publish a guide, HSG 168, Fire Safety on Construction Sites. Latest version was published in spring 2010. I don't think it's yet been updated to reflect the changes to the construction design and management regulations, which were published last year, but the guidance tends to be relatively generic and not so legislatively driven, I suppose. And what it does is, as well as providing practical guidance, it clearly establishes who the enforcing authority is in a range of circumstances, because it's not always clear-cut. It depends on the nature of the site, whether it's a standalone site, whether there's occupied elements of the premises during a refurbishment that might otherwise impact on how fire safety is managed, and again how fire safety is going to be enforced. Compliance with the Joint Code is all relatively straightforward in real terms. Its principal purpose is risk minimisation. So looking at ways to ensure, first and foremostly, that the potential for fire to start and the potential for fire to spread is carefully managed and is reduced to as low as reasonably practicable. However, we have to reflect on the fact that fires can and do start accidentally as well as deliberately, and so much of the code is focused around not just that prevent element, but also the protect side as well. The compliance with the code may be an insurance requirement. I'm sure you're familiar with the caveat at the front of the code, in particular for all projects with an original value of over £2.5 million. So as I mentioned earlier, the code is applicable not just during the construction phase. It's not just about ensuring that you're storing stuff correctly and that you're disposing of waste effectively and that you're not burning rubbish on site, and handling those specific issues during the time when work is undergoing. But it also expects some significant consideration of fire risk during the design phase. And I think that's often where it doesn't gain as much traction as we maybe would like it to. And if it doesn't, sadly that can store up problems for the future, or problems during the construction phase itself. But the design phase within the Joint Code does require an assessment of fire risk. So some thought needs to go into the potential for fire and what's going to be done, or what can be done by way of scheduling the materials that might ensure that risk is minimised. And it involves the principal designers and contractors, a requirement for them to discharge their duties under the CDM regs, and in particular to cooperate during all phases. Now, that's easier said than done very often. But the requirement exists, and there's an opportunity there if we're involved in a project at an early enough stage to try and ensure that some of these issues are picked up upon. It also goes on to make requirements for special considerations where there might be fire engineered solutions or where there might be large timber frame structures being put together. And we'll come on to some of the specifics, particularly with regard to large timber frame structures, in a short while. Moving on to the construction phase, or the responsibility for health and safety and in turn fire safety is passed from that designing contracting team onto the principal contractor. And there's a requirement there for them to ensure that there's a construction phase plan for health and safety, which will include the fire safety plan as an element of that. There's a requirement for a responsible person to be appointed. Now, that sort of flies in the face of legislation slightly because the regulatory reform order, for example, places the requirement for managing the general fire precautions aspects of fire safety on a responsible person, but it doesn't define who that responsible person is. Very often it won't be a named individual, it will be a board of directors or a board of trustees or something of that nature. But I think what the code is trying to focus on is the requirement for there to be somebody who's nominated to be in charge in real terms. So there's a focal point for fire safety. And it's their responsibility to implement and manage the general fire precautions across the site during the construction phase. Not always, it sounds very easy in that respect, doesn't it? But I think we all understand that construction environment is very much a movable feast. Nothing's the same from one day to the next, and the management of fire safety can be a far more, I suppose, fluid requirement than it would be in a fixed and static and occupied premises. Where we have high fire risk sites, and again I'll come on to what that might mean in a few moments, there's a requirement for the appointment of fire marshals and deputies. Their numbers to be determined by fire risk assessment, and wherever possible, they should be permanently based on site and full time. And they have specific roles and responsibilities for ensuring that certain routine checks are undertaken on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, and that there's recording and reporting of problems that might exist to ensure that fire safety is as effectively managed as it possibly could be. And the code also flags up the need to be aware of additional risks that might be associated with undertaking building works in premises where part of the premises is going to remain occupied. So this would be particularly the case where you're undertaking refurbishment works in an existing building, maybe refurbishing one floor of an existing multi-occupied building, maybe adding an extension to an existing building, or in some way impacting on what could be the existing fire precautions in a building by some form of modification. The Joint Code goes on to provide a bit of an outline of what the site fire safety plan is as well, and it's not my intention to read through this in detail, but there are certain issues there that are, I suppose, a little more important than others. I mentioned earlier the potential for, or the number of deliberate fires that occur on construction sites, and so ensuring that the building is, or the site is secure, is going to be one of the top priorities, and we'll touch on what that might mean a little later. But also also elements where you're trying to ensure that regardless of what's going on the site, by way of the construction activities, you're not introducing additional fire hazards that aren't being effectively managed and monitored. For example, if you're undertaking hot works of any sorts. So what does a high fire risk site mean? Well, the code defines it as a high-rise construction site where you might have the workforce beyond 30-metre reach of a position where a fire appliance might be parked. A large project with an original contract value is over £20 million. A large timber frame structure, which is classified as a timber frame structure of 4 or more stories. We might like to argue with that. And also projects where a risk assessment indicates that there's significant potential for loss of life or damage to property. So the code makes some specific requirements for high fire risk sites, as it does for large timber frame structures as well, independently, which are specific to these types of premises. We tend to think of the code, I suppose, as being about property protection because it's something that was originally driven by insurers. However, as you'll see, for those of you who have a copy in front of you, if not on your bedside tables, it's supported by a number of organisations, and we publish it jointly, the Risk Authority and the Contractors Legal Group, who represent the construction sector itself. And so the focus has got to be more than just on the property protection aspect, but also making sure we take on board the life safety considerations as well. And I'll touch on one or two of those as we move through. You can see on the slide in front of you a copy of a fire risk assessment, which I tend to suggest isn't suitable and sufficient in any way, shape or form. If you can read what it says on the left-hand side, this was a letter to London Fire Brigade, and names have been removed to protect the not so innocent. It says, "Dear Sir, I have inspected the building from top to bottom, and there is no fire risk on the premises." Sadly, when the Fire and Rescue Service, London Fire Brigade, as the header indicates, went in to inspect the building, the photographs on the right-hand side showed you what they found. So clearly, certain individuals have a very, very different view of what fire risk might be than what we might perceive it to be, and hence the need for guidance and codes and steerage so that people understand exactly where the issues lie. But that particular fire risk assessment is really something that's a requirement of the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, where there's a requirement there for you to do your fire risk assessment, and that is very much focused on the life safety elements of fire safety and ensuring that people can get out of the building effectively in the event that there's a fire. There's good warning, there's an opportunity to extinguish a fire should it be needed, and that there are safe escape routes which are well signed. And the code takes on board all of those things in addition to looking at the requirements for protecting the building from fire. I made reference earlier to the responsible person and the general fire precautions which they needed to apply. And again, there's a list on the screen there which describes some of those elements. Some again more important than others. Ensuring that a suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment is undertaken and maintained. Again, a fire risk assessment is a snapshot in time, but the legislation requires you to ensure that it remains suitable and sufficient. And so when you've got an ever-changing premises, such as you're going to have in a construction environment, you need to make sure that it's regularly updated and that whatever precautions are required at the time and looking forward are being suitably addressed. And then there's a requirement to ensure there's a hot work permit scheme in place and that's complied with, that there's appropriate checks on equipment and checks of escape routes, fire detection alarm system devices. There's no point in having them if they're not going to be functional. And also liaising with the local fire brigade. One of the key outcomes of the fire that happened at Minster Court was that although the fire and rescue services arrived in very short order, there was no delay in their being called and their arrival. And what they found when they arrived was a fairly significant fire already, and really difficult access to any of the hydrant points that they needed because they were within the hoarding of the building, and one or two of them were hidden beneath stocks of materials waiting to be either taken from the site or used on the site, so they had no access to a water supply. So ensuring that you maintain liaison with the local fire and rescue service, arrange for them to come in and visit the premises and understand what it looks like and how it's developing, where they're going to get their water supplies is going to be absolutely key. I'm going to touch on now some of the practical advice that comes out of the joint code with regard to certain specific issues. I'm not going to dwell on any of them in too much detail, just mindful of the time. But again, the information's all there for future reference if you want to use it. We were just discussing there the requirements for liaison with the emergency services. It's not just about familiarity, although of course that's really important. I think what you need to ensure is that yes, the local crews do know where the site is, they do know what the access arrangements are, they do know what the principal hazards are, and that can be handled in a number of ways, through visits and through, of course, the provision of information for them when they arrive on site that gives them everything they might need. But also ensuring that if there are water supplies, they're maintained and they're accessible and they're clearly marked, and that will ensure that if the worst does happen, at least when the fire and rescue service arrive, they can respond effectively and without delay. The code also goes on to talk about establishing and rehearsing emergency procedures, so ensuring that in the event that there's a problem, you can get people out of the building effectively, and if there are any steps that can be taken to ensure that fire spread is limited or minimised, that they can be taken at the same time, and that also there needs to be means of giving warning. And again, what you're going to use in that kind of cell, what you're going to use in each one of the different environments and different scenarios is going to differ from a klaxon or a handbell to a fairly comprehensive fire detection and alarm system, should that prove to be necessary due to the nature of the premises. Some sites may require a hardwired and linked system with call points, and others may use wireless type systems, which enables a degree of greater flexibility in maintaining effective systems across the site. With regard to fire protection, which is clearly going to be key, if you consider a construction environment, particularly where there are significant volumes of combustible materials for whatever reason, there is very often during the construction stage or during certain parts of the construction going to be times when there's limited compartmentation, so a fire spreading in one location can very quickly and very easily spread quite significantly. And so with regard to ensuring that fire spread is minimised, there's a series of requirements or a series of recommendations. More important of those, I think, being the early installation, where reasonably practical, as the heading says there, compartmentation walls, doors and fire stopping, protecting structural steelwork, and if you've got fire sprinkler and other fixed systems being installed, and where practicable they can be installed at an earlier stage, they're obviously going to provide a significant degree of protection than you would otherwise have. The list goes on. Again, touching on the requirements for access for the fire and rescue services, and then on high fire risk sites, there are additional requirements for testing water flows to ensure that there's adequate water supplies should they be necessary. If you're installing rising and temporary mains within the building as part of firefighting shafts, due to its size or nature, then ensuring that they're fully functional at the earliest possible opportunity is again going to be offer a significant benefit. And then just touching on the potential for deliberate fire setting, ensuring that you have adequate security, and as part of that you're having routine checks, particularly at the end of the day or while the site's unoccupied, to ensure that there's nothing of any significance from a fire safety perspective that needs to be addressed, or any incipient fires. So again, from a life safety perspective, the considerations are really with regard to means of escape and means of warning. There's a photograph there that one of my colleagues, who I'm sure most of you know, Adair Lewis, took whilst on holiday. Not your typical holiday shot, I have to say. Tanned legs on beaches and kids playing racquetball, but a picture of a building site there with a means of escape from the right-hand side of from the left-hand side of the photo was across those wooden bridges that had been created into the building on the right. That's not the sort of thing we'd expect, quite obviously, but examples of where contractors may try to ensure that they're meeting requirements, not necessarily in the most functional or safe ways. And the code expects there to be at least 2 routes available at all times, so people can turn their back on a fire and escape, which is as you would expect in the vast majority of occupied buildings, and that the means of escape should be inspected on a weekly basis. Dealing with a couple of more specifics and things that I think are important, the code makes requirements for the use of temporary covering materials. obviously in circumstances such as we were just discussing at Minster Court, where you've got significant volumes of scaffolding, or where there's an awful lot of finishes that need to be protected, particularly towards the end of a project. The use of temporary covering materials is quite common to ensure that finishes don't get damaged, or in the case of scaffolding, that stuff can't be dropped off a scaffold onto the public passing beneath. Introducing some form of plastic into that scenario is obviously going to increase the fire load quite significantly. And so there are specific requirements in the code for use of protective covering materials, which are third-party certified to specific standards. I've listed the 2 LPS documents there, which I'm sure you're familiar with, but there are similar standards which are produced by Exover Warrington that provide a similar degree of protection. And then at the bottom there, reference to the need for portable fire extinguishers. Again, if you consider why do we have fire extinguishers in buildings, the government would tell us that they're there for life safety purposes only, and should you need to tackle a small fire to affect your means of escape. However, I think we all recognise that in certain circumstances people will use them to extinguish a small fire before it becomes a large fire, and so having suitable number of appropriate fire extinguishers effectively located and properly maintained is a great way of providing that first line of defence. Site security against arson, we mentioned that. I mentioned this a couple of times now. There are a number of things you can do to protect a site. Statistically, I think it's noted that enclosing the whole site with a decent hoarding is the best way of protecting the site. It's the most effective means anyway. Yes, we can ensure that we can install CCTV, we can have PIR lighting, we can have manned guarding, all of those sorts of things, but if you can prevent somebody getting onto the site in the first place, or at least make it particularly difficult for them, then you're likely to avoid problems going forward. Sadly, the vast majority of fires that are started deliberately are started by teenagers, and they're not, well, they are doing it maliciously, of course they are, but they're not doing it in order to cause a contractor particular problems. Invariably, it's just mucking about as far as they see it. So if you can make it difficult for them to get onto the site in the first place, it's less of an enticement, it's less of a playground for them, and hence the premises should be far more secure. And of course, in addition to that, perimeter protection, making sure that if you have got anything that's particularly flammable by way of gases or HFO, flammable liquids, highly flammable liquids, that they're kept suitably secure. Temporary buildings and accommodation, we're introducing combustible materials onto a site. Very often there's a need to put any temporary accommodation into the building under construction, and the code makes some specific requirements with regard to their use and where they should be placed. And if you're going to put cabins within the building under construction, for them to have a degree of fire resistance, so that they're difficult to ignite in the first place. But also, should there be a fire, that they'll effectively contain the fire for a sensible period of time. The code makes requirements for 30 minutes fire resistance. But obviously, where they're going to be placed outside of the building under construction, which is a far more appropriate solution, there's a need to keep them at a safe distance. And again, if that can't be achieved, then a requirement for them to have an element of fire resistance, so as to ensure that if there is a fire, there's plenty of time to tackle it before the potential for that fire to spread to the building under construction is achieved. I've got a couple of slides here that just talk, really just a couple of lists really that cover some of those additional issues that the code covers. And again, sadly, there's not time to go through it in any detail, or all of it in any detail, but I will come on to one or two items in a bit more detail in a few moments, particularly with regard to hot work and acetylene and such like, which are well recognised as being significant causes of potential fires. you see at the bottom of that particular list, there's reference to the burning of vegetation or rubbish. And when the code was drafted and revised more recently, the decision was taken that we needed to make some reference to that. This is 1 or 2 editions ago now. We needed to make some reference to it, only because the HSG, or HSE's guidance, HSG 168, made reference to it. However, the approach that's taken is a very stringent one that requires the contractor to get permits from the Environment Agency and local authorities to a point where it would be very, very difficult, and I think slightly more expensive to take that route than it would be to dispose of the waste in more traditional ways. There's a couple of photos there. I'm sure, sorry you can't see them all, but it's there just really to reiterate the concerns and the problems associated with the use of acetylene on site. There was a van carrying an acetylene cylinder or an oxyacetylene set exploded, and you can see the damage that it did. We don't often get to see those sorts of images, except where these sorts of cylinders are being tested in a safe environment. But as you can see, the amount of damage that caused is quite significant, and I think it's easy then to reflect on why the Fire and Rescue Services take such a serious approach to circumstances or fires where cylinders may be involved, particularly where oxyacetylene sets may be involved, because of the potential for significant damage. And they will stand off for quite some time. They will clear certain areas around the incident, and they will wait for quite some considerable time if necessary to ensure that the cylinders are safe before they'll allow people back in. So not only got impacts on the site and what's going on the site, but those neighbouring premises that might also be implicated. Interestingly, behind that photograph there is a chart which I can't show you sadly because the animations aren't working effectively. But I think we all recognise that hot work is a serious issue and something needs to be done to ensure that if hot work is being undertaken, that it's being effectively managed. Now, the code makes recommendations for ensuring that hot work is only undertaken if there's no other way of doing it, and that where it does need to be done, that it's done in accordance with a strict hot work permit, and that competent people are employed not only to undertake the hot work, but also to do the risk assessments that are required to ensure that the area is safe. I've got a couple of images here very quickly. You might wonder why I'm referring you to statistics from Finland. But Nordic countries, Finland, Norway, Denmark and Sweden, have recognised that hot work has been a significant problem for them over many, many years, right back into the 1980s. And you can see there from the graph that's produced from their statistics that the number of fires caused by hot work was significant, and the major losses that they were seeing as a result of it were also very significant. But in around 1988, they introduced mandatory hot work training across these countries. So anybody who wants to undertake hot work or have any participation in hot work activities needs to be trained. The courses are a day long, and they get a certificate which lasts for a permit card to work that lasts for 5 years. And as you can see from the graph there, the trend line in particular, the 5-year average, that the number of fires and the losses from hot work have dropped very significantly over a relatively short period of time, and they continue to maintain that kind of confidence in their approach to date. In the UK, we don't have anything of that nature, and there's an image on the screen now of a fire that happened at a new building that was being put up in Camberley in Surrey. It was a new office building for use by the local authority, and result of the fire was a loss of around £2.5 million. Fire was caused by hot work being undertaken in the roof space, installation of new pipe work. The roof was lined with a mineral fibre insulation, but was held in place by a reinforced plastic sheeting, a thermoplastic sheet with a paper backing. Having completed the work installing this pipe, which was done by touch welding using an oxyacetylene set, the plumber hung about, as he was required to do, and noted after 5 or 10 minutes that there was smoke about a metre away from him. He started taking some of the insulation down and saw that there was significant burning in the plastic and paper that's been used to line the roof space. He clambered out of the roof, went down to the site office, asked them to call the fire and rescue service, went back with an extinguisher. By the time he got there, it was too late to do much about it. And the fire, by that point, had spread into the timber rafters. They were untreated and spread throughout the entire roof void. Now, the building was in 3 stages, or in three lumps, and the cavity barriers hadn't been installed at that point. So the roof void was, to all intents and purposes, one large open space, and so the fire was able to spread right through. There are many examples of fires caused by hot work. This is just one, but the causes are often always the same: lack of appropriate controls for whatever reason, and undertaking works in an environment where the fire precautions weren't as they should be. And the Joint Code makes recommendations for hot work which try to ensure that doesn't turn out to be the case. Back in 2007, FBA were approached by a contractor, or by a retailer, Tesco's, who are having some significant problems with hot works on their sites, particularly where they were bringing contractors in. That might be for refurbishment works, it might have been for new build works, and the numbers of fires caused by hot work was gradually increasing to a point where in 06-07 they had 35 significant fires, and they asked FBA to come in. We used the model that we were familiar with from the Nordic countries through our engagement in CFPA Europe, and we introduced a hot work permit scheme. There's just some stats on the screen there, but it's been interesting to note that the number of fires that Tesco are suffering as a result of hot work has been reduced to negligible now, and where they are occurring, they're very much being controlled before they become of any significance. As I mentioned earlier, we're now on the 9th edition of the Joint Code, and there's just some highlights there of what changed. Principal changes in the 7th, 8th and 9th editions. The bottom chunk of text covers the changes in the 9th edition specifically, but we've had to introduce specific requirements for modern methods of construction, for high-rise construction methods and materials, and large timber frame structures. In the 9th edition, the changes were principally undertaken to reflect the latest edition of the Construction Design and Management Regulations, which, to all intents and purposes, was tweaking requirements and responsibilities for contractors and designers. But we went on to tackle some other issues, such as liaison with the emergency services and strengthening that requirement, talking about issues associated with PV systems and the location of inverters and isolators. The overprinting of temporary covering materials. We're finding instances where certified materials were subsequently being overprinted, which was ruining their resistance to ignition. A requirement for third-party certified temporary covering materials to be used exclusively across site rather than just in certain circumstances. Changing the periods of fire watch for hot work operations. Not allowing the use of PV as a temporary power supply during construction. And the installation of detection in enclosed spaces, and the extension of systems as work progresses in large timber frame structures to ensure that there's early warning of fire as soon as practicable. High-rise construction sites, clearly the problems are fairly evident. You've got extended escape times, incomplete compartmentation, stacking of fire load, and very often inadequate water supplies for firefighting, and so that the code goes in to make certain requirements to ensure that those issues are addressed. In particular, the focus is on liaison with the emergency services and the effective compartmentation of the building, even if that needs to be on a temporary rather than installing the permanent finished structures. But at least ensuring that if there is a fire, it is limited in scope or limited in the spaces that it can spread to. And wherever possible, if you have protection systems that are meant to be installed, that they're installed as early as they possibly can be. An example there of a fire that happened in Dubai during the construction phase. Got a couple more examples of fires in Dubai, sadly, coming up in a few moments. But the building, as you can see, wasn't finished. The fire started in a shaft that ran up the full height of the building, and somehow waste packaging became involved, or it was ignited. Fire and rescue services were slow to arrive. There were workers trapped on upper floors, seen waving towels, trying to attract attention. Despite the fact that I always tell people that the helicopters don't arrive to rescue you, so never escape up onto the roof. They did in this occasion, and a number of people were evacuated from the roof of the building via helicopters. Not something that we'd advocate. 4 people died, 27 people lost their lives, significant damage, and a significant delay in the construction process. Timber frame buildings, we're seeing and continue to see increased use of timber frame as a construction method in the UK. You very often hear that we're told that, well, they do this all the time in the US, don't they, and they don't have problems. Well, there's just a few statistics there which tend to debunk that. Unprotected wood frame buildings under construction are the most frequent large loss fires in the United States. Probably don't need to go into any more detail than that, but the slide goes on to describe various other statistics that are related to the completed buildings and the problems that continue to exist in that respect. An example there of a fire that I think we're probably all familiar with, building during construction, Sumner Road in Peckham, a single building, 4-storey timber frame block with a flat roof. Non-flame retardant timber was used, and the frame itself was unprotected to all intents and purposes. It had a weatherproof breather membrane installed. 10 people were admitted to hospital as a result of the fire. And the fire occurred 12 hours after the last member of staff had left. It started at 4:30 in the morning, destroyed the entire block, caused a lot of damage to buildings round and about due to the radiant heat, significant volumes of and strong winds. The gates were locked at the time of the incident, and sadly there was no conclusion to the cause. It was most probably cited as being of human origin in the ground floor southwest corner. There was evidence of trespass, but there was no multiple points of ignition and no flammables detected. So in one of those circumstances, clearly if it had been a concrete frame or a steel frame building, the outturn would have been quite significantly different. And it's just a view of adjacent blocks that were damaged. Similar fire in Camberwell, same contractor, nothing suspicious about that, of course. And there were 3 separate blocks here. The lower floors had been built out of non-combustible construction. I think it was reinforced concrete. However, the upper floors were all timber framed. Fire occurred, it destroyed all of the timber frame for 2 of the blocks and did significant black damage to the third. Again, the most likely cause of the fire was deliberate. There was no electrical equipment on site. There were no multiple ignition points. There was, however, lots of smoking evident and piles of sawdust, and it's thought that there may have been a slow smouldering fire that caused it. However, there's still no clarity. Just signs of further damage. So why are fires in timber frames so hazardous? Well, they're vulnerable due to arson, although not all fires are arson. Plentiful supply of oxygen, heat radiates and convects effectively within what is a timber crib. It's intense and rapid, so it can escalate very, very quickly. And there's a significant off-site risk, as we've seen in a number of circumstances, including the fire that happened at Aerodrome Road in Colindale or Hendon. And once it takes hold, it can be significantly difficult to put it out. So the Joint Code makes recommendations for fire safety in large timber frame buildings, which start with constructing the ground floor or the lower floors of a non-combustible material, so reinforced concrete steel frame, something of that nature, where the potential for fire is significantly reduced, and also using an appropriately pressurised treated FR timber. Can't be enforced, but that's certainly what the code requires, and it also reflects on the specific risks that exist in that sort of environment where you've got multiple structures built on one site, the potential for fire to spread during that construction phase when there's no installation of anything that's likely to limit the potential for ignition or limit the potential for fire to spread from one space to another, and then goes on really to make recommendations for ensuring that where possible the structures are effectively separated, that suitable compartmentation is installed, and that fire risk is minimised by reducing the potential for ignition through managing ignition sources effectively. I suppose you should also, before we move on to that, reflect on the fact that I think they're called the Structural Timber Association, have their own guidance now. It used to be UK Timber Frame Association, and they have produced a number of guides which support the use of timber frame during construction and make specific recommendations and requirements for ensuring that effective procedures are taken to minimise fire risk. One of their documents is a design guide for separation distances during construction. It's endorsed by the Health and Safety Executive, and it's endorsed by CIREG. And I think something that we're mindful of, or something we're aware of within the Fire Protection Association, that is that the HSE take this very seriously. We've been referred to a number of projects where the HSE have criticised the design and have called into question the suitability of the construction materials and construction method, and we've had to go in and support the contractor in doing the risk assessment work that's required, and providing them with some guidance as to the approach that they can take to minimise fire risk, and should they wish to continue to use timber frame as their preferred method of construction. Modern methods of construction, similar problem, not just in occupied buildings but also during construction. Potential to have large voids, potential for the use of significant volumes of combustible materials, and the need to take additional precautions to manage that effectively. Modular construction, again, sadly, there's a few images behind that, but that's a modular building, not necessarily something you'd recognise as being built in a modular style when looking at it from the outside, but it is a modular construction, and problems exist with regards, as I just mentioned, with the potential for there to be unstopped voids where services are run, or gaps in construction which haven't been adequately protected and fire stopped. And a fire in that kind of building has the potential to do significant damage, and can also make life very, very difficult if it comes to repair or renovation following a fire. But during the construction phase, you have that additional concern that you might have a lot of exposed combustible materials, and before any fire stopping is installed, the potential again for fire to spread quite rapidly. The use of structurally insulated panels, something we're all relatively familiar with, and if installed and maintained effectively, shouldn't present too much of a risk. But as you can see from that image on the screen at the moment you start to chase in, exposing the core, or you're creating any kind of void or puncture through the panel, you're obviously going to expose the core to fire, smoke, ignition sources, whatever it might be, and heat, and the potential for fire to spread if those kinds of issues aren't adequately addressed through the use of appropriate fire-stopping materials, insulation and the like, to protect what goes on behind. A couple of examples there of where combustible external cladding have caused problems. The picture on the left-hand side is of a block in Marseille in France. It's thought that somebody was barbecuing on the balcony. Fire caught into the combustible materials behind the external cladding and spread up the building very, very rapidly. There are videos of this on YouTube, should you want to look at them. And the fire on the right-hand side was another example of a building in Dubai, just trying to recollect its name now. It's called the Address Downtown. Strange old name, but who are we to comment? And the fire was caused by a fault in an electrical circuit or a light melting electrical cabling on one of the upper floors. And as you can see, the fire spread quite rapidly. Again, the problems with the use of combustible materials to clad thermally insulate the building externally is that they won't only just spread the fire up, but there's a potential for burning droplets and such like to fall down and start fires beneath the initial source of ignition. As you may be aware, Risk Authority has been running some tests on these external thermal insulation composite systems, and there are reports available, I understand, that describe that the tests. There's just a few images on the screen there that show that in the event that you do have a fire, we were using a source that's a wheelie bin full up with rubbish. But in the event that there is a fire, depending on the circumstances and depending on the standard of installation and the number of penetrations through the render covering, the fire will behave very, very differently. But the two images on the right-hand side show an example where the render was punctured as if to install bathroom vents and such like. And as you can see, the damage to the insulation behind the render, and obviously whatever was behind it in the construction itself would be badly affected, and more so than if the render remains complete. We were testing against a blockwork wall, so the fire went nowhere. But if that was a timber frame building, it could be a very, very different outcome. Insulating concrete forms is something you may have come across, not so prevalent in the UK, used quite commonly in Southern Ireland, using polystyrene to create formwork, filling the gaps in between with concrete. But again, you've got a combustible cladding material, which if ignited will rapidly spread fire very, very quickly indeed. There's an example there of a domestic construction. Sadly, some of the images behind that, which you can't see, also show it being used quite extensively in a more commercial environment. And that's a shot from that just shows the use of different ways, I suppose, of heating and cooling our buildings. These are panels, and albeit we wouldn't necessarily be concerned with what we're looking at there, different ways of heating and cooling our buildings now mean that in order to, being driven by the sustainability agenda, is causing additional problems within the buildings themselves. We were obviously aware of the problems that are associated with the installation of PV panels and the Risk Authority guidance that's already been published in that respect. But the concerns that are raised with regard to the potential for impacts inside the building itself also need to be addressed, because in installing these sorts of systems you need different ways of controlling it. There is also the potential for far more significant penetrations of compartmentation lines, which again in themselves will need fire stopping. And so there are additional considerations and concerns associated with the use of more modern ways of heating and cooling our buildings nowadays, which need to be considered. And also the use of unusual construction materials, sheet wool insulation. It will behave in a certain way. Hempcrete, nobody seems to know how that will perform in the event of a fire. Hopefully very safely, but there is just no information which explains how that's likely to behave. The Joint Code of Practice comes with not just the code itself, but also with a checklist. There are electronic versions available that you can use to keep a record of the checks and balances that are being taken during the construction phase to manage fire safety. Both of those are documents that are available through the FPA website. That's it. Thank you very much for listening. I'm so sorry that I've run massively over the 35 minutes I was originally told, but it's difficult to keep these things short and cover enough bases for everybody. As you can see on the slide there, the next webinar is on Friday the 10th of June, and we're dealing with fire safety with flammable liquids. My colleague Adair Lewis will be we'll be presenting that webinar. But for now, thank you very much for listening and paying attention. I'm just going to have a quick look at some of the questions that popped up to see if we can make any, if there's anything there that we can address. You'll have to excuse me while I just scroll through what's appeared. I've got Dominic sat with me. He might know how you can get hold of a copy of the presentation. Oh, okay. I'm told it will be online in a few days, Gina. So hopefully you'll be in a position to get hold of it once it's been posted online. There's a question from Robert Bacon with regard to, are there any approved overprinting companies for the LPS 1215 approved coverings? I'm afraid I don't know, Robert. I'm not aware of any in particular, and I think it's probably something that might be more easily addressed with LPCB or BRE certification if they can give you a steer in that direction. I think, as you've said in your question, I've seen a number of cases where there's been extensive overprinting and advertising, and there is a need to ensure that whatever's being done in that respect isn't going to impact on the ignition propensity of the materials themselves and their potential for fire propagation. But quite where you'd go for that, I'm not entirely sure. But I'm sure this is a question that BRE must have been asked, so it might be worth asking them to see if they know. I see you seem to be suggesting from your question you've asked for them to be removed in the past, and I think that for the want of a better answer, that's probably the best way forward. Steve Davidson makes a comment, as arson is the most common cause of fires on sites, waste management is of significant importance as this provides the most common source for, he says, scrolling down, for fire starters on sites. Maybe worth a mention. You're exactly right. Thank you very much for that. There is guidance within the Joint Code that talks about waste management, and again, you're quite right. It's very, very important. So important. So we've come across a number of occasions now where certain sites, I think the new build at Heathrow T5, they had 1 day a week where they refused or they wouldn't take any deliveries onto the site, and time was spent by the general workforce in ensuring that any combustible waste and packaging and such like was effectively cleared from the site, and that where they were introducing materials that were going to be used during the construction phase that were combustible in nature, that they were being effectively protected. So, yes, thank you for that comment. Question now, hopefully I've covered the MMC issues. And a question from Robert Foggett, do you endorse the Structural Timber Association guidance, or are there areas where you consider it to be inadequate? I think that the Joint Code does refer to the TFA guidance in the references section, and I think that if the guidance is going to be applied effectively, then it's certainly going to minimise risk. However, there is that additional guidance within the Joint Code which is designed to ensure that where timber frame is used, that the potential for fire is minimised, and should a fire start, that there are effective or more effective mitigations in place than you might be looking for in a building that's constructed of masonry. But as I mentioned a little bit earlier on, as an organisation, FPA have been drawn into on a couple of occasions to provide guidance to contractors where the HSE have come down very hard on them for their use of timber frame, where they haven't been applying the Structural Timber Association guidance effectively, and hopefully they'll continue to take that approach. I've already answered the question about that, and thanks. That's very kind. Okay, well, I'm afraid I'm being given I've got to cut it off now, so thanks for your questions again, thanks for your participation, thanks for your questions. I hope you found it interesting, and as Dominic mentioned, a copy of the presentation will be available online in three or four days. Have a great weekend. If you're having a barbecue, make sure you set it up a sensible distance from the back of your house and from any combustible sheds or fences, and that's it from me. Thank you.